Hey everyone, welcome to the New Populist. I'm Dave Brown. If you are new to this channel, please like and subscribe. Well, today is Monday, the day after the Super Bowl, and it would seem that this trucker protest never materialized. Now, a few days ago, the Department of Homeland Security had put out a memo saying that there was this online chatter among right-wing groups and white supremacists talking about organizing a trucker protest at the Super Bowl in LA and have it move across the country to Washington, D.C. And again, it didn't happen. And the question is, why did it not happen? Well, there's several reasons, but the main thing is economics. If you boil everything down, you look at personal interest and how something affects somebody economically. Now, early on in the pandemic, back in March, April of 2020, there was a direct correlation, and I'm sure you noticed this as well, between people who supported the lockdowns and the quarantines and people who had jobs that were flexible for them to work at home. So they never missed a paycheck, and they never had it hurt them personally. Versus people who, say, worked in the restaurant industry and saw their restaurant shut down and they lost hours and the ability to work every day. And of course, again, they were against these lockdowns. So people are always motivated by their personal interest. And when we examine the U.S. and Canadian truckers, they are in very different positions. And the first one is that thing is, in the U.S., there isn't a mandate for most truckers unless you cross the U.S.-Canada border. Now, this is the crux of the whole thing. This issue disproportionately affects Canadian truckers. Now, 90% of Canadians live within 100 miles of the U.S. border, and the reverse is not true. So there's a lot of activity around that border by Canadians, whereas again, most Americans, unless you live in, say, Michigan and parts of New York State, you're not that close to the Canadian border in that eastern corridor around the Great Lakes. So the Canadian truckers, because of that, are much more likely to need to cross the border. And when you look at the actual economic figures, Canada has a GDP of $1.64 trillion, and the United States GDP is $20.94 trillion. Now, our trade between the countries is pretty even. We export about $360 billion worth of goods to Canada and vice versa. But if you take that number as a percentage of GDP, 20% of Canada's GDP is exported into the United States. The reverse is only 1.7% of the US GDP is exported into Canada. So as a part of their whole economy, Canadian exports to the United States is a much bigger figure than US exports into Canada. So again, there is much more of a need for the Canadian truckers as a percentage to need to enter into the United States. And one other thing I thought was interesting too is the issue of self-ownership. Now, if you work for a company and you don't own your own truck, you can't do this protest because it's not your property. And this issue about private ownership is very important because this is not just for truckers, but in general, when you have all these corporations owning everything and you work for corporations, you are essentially handcuffed. Now, 22% of Canadian truckers own their own trucks, versus the United States, it's about 10%. So there's much more percentage-wise of Canadians who own their own trucks versus the United States. So this gives them sort of this extra flexibility to protest because they're not using corporate property. So for all those reasons, the Canadians had a much bigger reason to protest these draconian rules that was set in place by Justin Trudeau and the government there. And in the United States, there simply isn't that same pressure. And without that pressure, without that thing to personally affect people, people really don't fight back. As it turns out, most people are not martyrs. They're not going to sacrifice their own livelihood for somebody else. They won't start pushing back until it affects them directly. So will there be a U.S. trucker protest in the future? Perhaps. But unfortunately, we just don't have that same pressure here in the United States to really push it forward. So I hope it happens, but I'm not optimistic that it will. And of course, we know that the Department of Homeland Security is very carefully monitoring this, and God knows what they're doing to prevent it, to undermine it, and to kill it in this crib. So I'm not too optimistic that we will see one here. That's it for now. Again, if you are new to the channel, please like and subscribe. I'll see you next time.